You already know what jealousy feels like. You don't need it described to you. That specific tightening in the chest, the sudden hyper-awareness of someone else's presence in a room, the quiet, relentless scanning. The way your mind starts running scenarios you didn't ask it to run, building cases, finding evidence, drawing conclusions you're simultaneously desperate to confirm and desperate to be wrong about. It is one of the most recognizable, most universally understood human experiences there is. And it is also, if you stop and actually look at it directly, one of the most genuinely strange. Because jealousy doesn't feel like something you choose. It feels like something that happens to you. Something that activates, almost mechanically, in specific circumstances, in response to specific triggers, with a specific emotional texture that is entirely distinct from other negative emotions. It is not quite the same as anger, though anger is often inside it. It is not quite the same as sadness, though sadness is, frequently underneath it. It is not quite the same as fear, though fear is running through every part of it. It is its own thing, a specific compound emotion with a specific structure. And once you start asking why that structure exists at all, why the human mind would be built to generate this particular experience in response to this particular set of circumstances, the answer goes somewhere most people don't expect. So when did humans first get jealous? The simple answer is that jealousy, or something functionally identical to it, almost, certainly predates humanity itself. But the full answer is considerably more interesting than that, and it requires unpacking what jealousy actually is, what it's actually doing, and why the fact that it feels so terrible is not a design flaw, but something much closer to the point. Let's start with a definition, because jealousy is one of those words that gets used imprecisely in ways that matter. Jealousy and envy are frequently conflated in everyday speech, but they are psychologically distinct experiences that researchers treat as separate phenomena, and the distinction is important. Envy is a two-party situation. You want something someone else has. A possession, a quality, a status, an opportunity. The emotional structure of envy is, they have something I want and don't have. Envy can be painful, but its target is relatively simple. It's about a desired object or quality you currently lack. Jealousy is a three-party situation. You have something, a relationship, or a bond that you fear losing to a third party. The emotional structure of jealousy is, something I already have and value is being threatened by someone else's presence or actions. Jealousy is fundamentally about perceived threat to an existing relationship, not about wanting what someone else has. This distinction matters enormously when you try to understand jealousy's evolutionary origins, because the three-party structure of jealousy tells you exactly what it evolved to protect. It is a threat detection system specifically calibrated for social bonds, a behavioral alarm that activates when the relationships you depend on are perceived to be at risk from a rival. And that function, threat detection for valued social bonds, is not a modern human invention, not even close. Let's talk about animals, because the evidence from other species is where this gets immediately and deeply interesting. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific view was that jealousy was a uniquely human emotion, too cognitively complex, too dependent on self-awareness and theory of mind to exist in non-human animals. Animals might compete for resources and mates. But actual jealousy, the specific experience of feeling threatened by a rival's access to a valued relationship, was assumed to require a level of cognitive sophistication only humans possessed. That view has been substantially revised. The evidence began accumulating seriously with a landmark 2014 study by Christine Harris and Caroline Provost at the University of California, San Diego. The researchers had dog owners ignore their own dogs while either interacting with a realistic stuffed dog that barked, whined, and wagged its tail, or interacting with a jack-o'-lantern pail or reading a book aloud. The dog's behavioral responses were filmed and coded. The results were striking. Dogs whose owners paid attention to the stuffed dog showed significantly more jealous behaviors than dogs in the other conditions. They pushed against their owners, tried to get between the owner and the stuffed dog, snapped at the stuffed animal, and showed elevated attention-seeking behavior directed at their owners. And here's the crucial detail. The dogs were showing these responses to something they could likely detect was not a real dog. They responded to the perception of their social bond being redirected, even when the rival was a stuffed toy. This behavioral pattern, trying to reestablish exclusive access to a valued social partner when that partner's attention is perceived to be redirected toward a potential rival, maps precisely onto the functional definition of jealousy. Dogs are not alone. Studies on primates have documented behavior that looks remarkably like jealousy across multiple species. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show behavioral responses consistent with jealousy in social contexts involving preferred grooming partners, food-sharing relationships, and mating access. Female baboons have been documented showing what researchers describe as affiliative jealousy, attempting to disrupt the formation of close social bonds between their primary male partner and other females. Not through direct aggression, but through persistent social insertion, the primate equivalent of making your presence impossible to ignore in a room where you feel threatened. Horses show behavioral distress when their bonded companion receives the attention of another horse. Even some bird species, particularly those with strong pair bonds like certain corvids and some parrot species, show behavioral indicators consistent with jealous responses when their bonded partner interacts closely with a potential rival. The evolutionary logic here is not complicated, but it is important. For any species in which stable social bonds confer survival and reproductive advantages, losing those bonds to rivals represents a genuine fitness cost. Natural selection should favor individuals who are sensitive to threats against their valued social bonds and who are motivated to respond actively to those threats. A mechanism that monitors for potential bond disruption and generates a compelling emotional signal that motivates protective behavior would be enormously adaptive in any social species where those bonds matter. Jealousy, in other words, is not a human invention. It is an ancient social alarm system that appears to have evolved independently or to have been inherited from deep ancestral lineages across a broad range of social species wherever stable social bonds have survival and reproductive value, which means the emotional structure you experience as jealousy is probably far older than our species. It may be millions of years old, predating the emergence of Homo sapiens by an enormous margin. But here is where the human version of jealousy gets genuinely interesting, because while the basic alarm structure appears to be ancient and widely shared, the human elaboration of that alarm is something considerably more complex, more cognitively demanding, and in many ways more specifically torturous than what most other species appear to experience. Human jealousy doesn't just activate a behavioral response. It generates an entire cognitive and emotional architecture around the threat. It runs scenarios. It reconstructs past events in light of the new perceived threat, reinterpreting memories that previously seemed neutral as potential evidence. It projects forward into imagined futures. It generates comparison, the painful side-by-side assessment of yourself against the perceived rival, that particular flavor of self-diminishment that jealousy specializes in producing. None of that extended cognitive elaboration appears to be necessary for the basic functional alarm to do its job. A dog doesn't need to run elaborate mental scenarios about the stuffed dog's qualities compared to its own in order to respond protectively when its owner's attention is redirected. But humans do. Or rather, humans can't seem to help doing it even, when it causes them significant pain and serves them poorly. This cognitive elaboration almost certainly reflects the expansion of human prefrontal cortex function and the broader development of human social intelligence across our evolutionary history. As the social environments humans navigated became more complex, as communities became larger, as social hierarchies became more elaborate, as long-term pair bonds and extended family networks became more critical to survival and reproductive success, the basic jealousy alarm system was recruited to operate in an increasingly complex social landscape, and in that landscape, more elaborate threat. Assessment and scenario building was genuinely adaptive. You needed to be able to model the rival's behavior, predict likely future threats, reconstruct past interactions for evidence of betrayal, and develop strategies that went beyond simple behavioral insertion. The problem is that this cognitive machinery doesn't have an off switch. Once activated, it runs, and running it at full. Capacity in the context of modern human social complexity, where the threats are often ambiguous, the rivals are sometimes imaginary or wildly overestimated, and the scenarios multiply faster than any evidence can resolve them, produces experiences that can be genuinely debilitating. You evolved the cognitive firepower to run sophisticated threat assessments in complex social environments. That same firepower, applied to an ambiguous social situation with no clear resolution, will run the threat assessment process indefinitely. The machinery doesn't know when to stop because it evolved in an environment where social threats were real, specific, and resolution was usually provided by actual events rather than prolonged ambiguity. Now let's talk about the two flavors of human jealousy, because research consistently identifies two distinct forms that serve different evolved functions, and understanding both clarifies something important about where jealousy comes from and what it's trying to do. Sexual jealousy is the form most people think of first. It is the emotional response to perceived or actual sexual or romantic infidelity, or to the threat of it. And research across cultures has consistently documented that while both sexes experience sexual jealousy, the specific triggers that produce the most intense responses show systematic differences that map precisely onto different evolved concerns. Studies, most famously associated with evolutionary psychologist David Buss, have found that men on average show stronger jealousy responses to imagined sexual infidelity, meaning the thought of a partner having a sexual encounter with a rival, while women on average show stronger responses to imagined emotional infidelity, meaning the thought of a partner forming a deep emotional bond with a rival, even without sexual contact. The evolutionary logic proposed for this difference is the following. For males in a sexually reproducing species, the primary fitness threat posed by a partner's infidelity is the risk of investing resources in offspring that are not genetically their own. Sexual infidelity by a female partner creates this risk directly. For females, whose offspring investment is already guaranteed by the biological fact of pregnancy and birth, the primary fitness threat posed by a partner's infidelity is the potential loss of that partner's resources, protection, and parental investment to a rival female and her offspring. Emotional infidelity is more predictive of this kind of resource diversion than sexual infidelity alone. This evolutionary argument remains debated. Critics have argued that the measured sex differences in jealousy responses are smaller than often claimed, that they are significantly influenced by cultural context and social learning rather than purely innate biological predispositions, and that the underlying evolutionary assumptions themselves are subject to challenge. The data is real. The interpretation is contested, and that contested middle ground is actually where the most interesting science lives. The second form is social jealousy, sometimes called affiliative jealousy, and it is in some ways the older, more foundational form. Social jealousy is the threat response to losing a valued social relationship, a friendship, a family bond, a position within a social network, to a rival, irrespective of any sexual or romantic dimension. This is what you see in children as young as 6 months old, making it one of the earliest complex emotional responses to appear in human development. Infants show clear signs of distress and increased attachment-seeking behavior when a primary caregiver directs warm attention toward another infant or child. They don't have the cognitive capacity to run elaborate scenarios about romantic rivals. They have the basic alarm. My bond is being redirected. My access to something I depend on is under threat. Respond. This developmental appearance of jealousy, before most other complex social emotions, before full theory of mind, before language, before any socialized understanding of relationships and their norms, strongly supports the view that the core jealousy mechanism is not a sophisticated cognitive construction, but something considerably more basic, a phylogenetically ancient alarm that is present and functional in humans before much of the cognitive architecture that will later elaborate and complicate it is even developed. 6-month-old infants cannot be envious in the classical sense. They cannot conceptualize having or not having social status. They cannot reflect on the qualities of a rival or compare themselves unfavorably, but they can be jealous in the functional sense, detecting a threat to a valued bond and responding with behavior designed to reestablish access. The alarm is there before the elaboration. The machinery comes first. The cognitive story we build around it comes later. Let's talk about what jealousy actually does to the body, because the physiological experience of jealousy is another piece of evidence about how old and how deeply embedded this system is. Jealousy activates the same basic threat response systems as physical danger. Cortisol levels rise, heart rate increases, attention narrows and sharpens. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes highly active. The prefrontal cortex, the region associated with rational deliberation and impulse control, can become relatively suppressed by the flood of emotional activation. This physiological profile is not what you would expect if jealousy were a sophisticated modern cognitive construction. It is exactly what you would expect from an ancient survival alarm being triggered. The body treats a perceived social threat with something close to the same urgency it treats a physical threat, because for most of human evolutionary history, losing critical social bonds was genuinely life-threatening. Being excluded from the group, losing a Primary bonded partner support, falling out of a protective social network, these were not merely emotionally painful. They were survival risks of the most serious kind. The body never evolved to treat them as anything less. There's something worth sitting with there. The reason jealousy feels so physically overwhelming, the reason it hijacks cognition so effectively, the reason it is so difficult to reason yourself out of, even when you can clearly see that. Your response is disproportionate to the actual threat, is that the system generating it doesn't know it's disproportionate. It was calibrated in an environment where social bond loss could literally kill you. It has not been. Recalibrated for an environment where, in most modern contexts, losing a relationship, while genuinely painful, is not a physical survival threat in the same immediate sense. You are running ancient threat response software in a modern environment. The software doesn't get updates. It just runs. And it runs exactly as designed, which is to say it runs hard, it runs fast, and it is very difficult to switch off. Because in the environment it was designed for, switching off quickly would have been extremely dangerous. Here's something about jealousy that rarely gets discussed in these terms, but is probably the most important thing about it, from an evolutionary standpoint. Jealousy is primarily an evidence of value. You cannot be jealous of something you don't care about. The intensity of the jealousy response is roughly calibrated, not perfectly, but roughly, to the importance of the bond being perceived as threatened. The most searing, most cognitively consuming jealousy arises around the relationships that matter most. Which means that as an emotional signal, jealousy is in some sense a readout of your own values and attachments. It is your brain's way of telling you, with complete physiological force, that this matters. That this relationship, this bond, this person registers as important. Enough to your survival and well-being that losing them to a rival activates the same systems that activate when you're facing physical danger. That framing doesn't make jealousy comfortable. It doesn't make the cognitive elaboration less painful or the amygdala less overactive. But it does situate jealousy as something other than a flaw or a weakness or an embarrassing emotional failure. It is an ancient signal, conserved across millions of years and dozens of species, that in its core function is simply telling you what you care about. What you do with that signal is the genuinely modern question. Because unlike most of the species that share the basic jealousy alarm with us, humans have the cognitive capacity to reflect on that signal, to evaluate whether the threat it is responding to is real or imagined, proportionate or wildly overestimated. We can examine the scenarios our minds are running and ask whether the evidence actually supports them. We can recognize that the physiological urgency of the response does not guarantee the accuracy of the threat assessment it's producing. We can choose, sometimes with great difficulty, to respond to the signal with something other than the behavioral output it was originally designed to produce. This is not easy. The signal is old and powerful, and specifically designed to be resistant to easy suppression, because easy suppression would have been maladaptive in the environment that produced it. But it is possible in ways that are genuinely unique to the human cognitive toolkit. So when did humans first get jealous? The honest answer is that we didn't, not exactly, not as an original invention of our species. We inherited an ancient social alarm system that had likely been operating across primate lineages for millions of years before anything resembling Homo sapiens walked the earth. 6-month-old infants run the basic version of it, before they have the cognitive architecture to elaborate it into anything recognizable as the full adult experience. Dog.